The 2000 One Piece movie is the first in a line of dozens of One Piece movies and specials that take the Straw Hat crew into unique and fun adventures away from their primary journeys. But the One Piece movie still seems to tell something important and useful about what the One Piece story is about and what these characters are about, aside from allowing the audience to experience a fun adventure with the Straw Hat crew. In this video, we'll be reviewing the first One Piece movie titled The One Piece Movie, released in 2000. The One Piece movie is about the Straw Hat Pirates and takes place at some point after Usopp joins the crew and before Sanji joins the crew. The Straw Hats have an encounter with a trio of pirate thieves who are captained by a man named El Drago, who is on the search for the legendary treasure of another pirate by the name of Wunan. A pirate who they claimed they have already defeated, but had a secret treasure someplace hidden on a shrouded island. The Straw Hats met a young boy named Tobio, who was the helmsman of the thieves' ship. After Luffy destroys that boat, he and Zoro get separated from the rest of the crew, and they find themselves on a floating Oden shop. The Oden shop is ran by a man named Gonzo, who is Tobio's grandfather. Luffy and Zoro eat after being very hungry, as Luffy ate all of the food on the ship prior to then, but they can't pay. Eventually, they find themselves on the island where they try to retrieve the Going Merry and reunite with the rest of their crew, the same island that is being searched by El Drago's pirate crew. Eventually, there is a confrontation between the Straw Hats and El Drago's pirate crew, as Usopp has been captured, pretending to know the whereabouts of the secret treasure, and then Nami tries to help him out on their way to that treasure. There is a fight between the Straw Hats and the El Drago pirates. Zoro and Luffy defeat the pirates with general ease, but not without putting up a fight, as they had a very strong swordsman and they had El Drago, who has the power of a devil fruit, which allows him to condense his screams into a blast of destruction. After the defeat, the Straw Hats, Gonzo, and Tobio find the secret lair and treasure of Wunan, who the audience comes to find out is the oldest and best friend of Gonzo, who came to the island to bring a pot of Oden to greet his old friend. They also found that all that Wunan's treasure is gone. Wunan, also known as the King of Gold Pirate, gave all of his treasure back to where it was taken at the end of his life because of the words of his very best and most important friend, Gonzo. They pay their final respects to Wunan, and Luffy and the Straw Hats leave. Luffy does mention to Tobio that he wonders whether he's going to continue on his father's tradition of making and selling Oden, or if he's going to go to the sea and be a pirate. Tobio says he hasn't decided. Some of the things that I thought was really interesting about this movie was its general one-piecedness. I like the way it kind of points to other narratives and symbols and metaphors that are taking place in the One Piece story. One of the things that stuck out to me really early on was the fact that Gonzo was an Oden shop owner. Oden is the name of a type of dish in Japan that is very traditional and fairly popular. Now, within the One Piece lore, Oden also has another very important meaning. Its origin is in Wano. As a key player of that arc, Oden is the primary protagonist and most important character in that arc. He was the person that opposed Kaido for the first time and was a legendary swordsman and became a member of the Roger Pirates for a short time, in addition to the Whitebeard Pirates prior. He was also a figure that made it all the way to Laugh Tale, being a reader of poneglyphs. So it seems very intentional the way that they make Oden a clear and present plot point in this story in this very first movie of One Piece. It seems that this is a very clear point of foreshadowing of other things that are going to come later on in the series. In the way that Oden is so prominently presented here as a key plot point. It makes you think about how much of the story Oden knew really early on, as this movie was made in 2000 and Oden wasn't presented to the audience until the 2010s. But because of Oden's clear narrative presence here, it's very obviously a point of foreshadowing of other important Odins to come later on in the series. I also thought it was very interesting that they made the primary folklore around a figure that is very similar to Goldie Roger, this Wunan character. Wunan is supposed to be a great gold pirate, very similar to the king of the pirates. And the way that they talk about his fortune and his prominence as a pirate is very similar to the way that Goldie Roger is presented in the narrative as well. But what they do at the end is show that Wu Nan was a person that had some kind of epiphany at the end of his life and gave away all of the gold that he has. The movie actually says that he returned it to where it was taken from. So because of the parallels that he and Gold Roger have, it seems logical to question what the One Piece is and if the One Piece is something that we're not expecting at all. I think it's fairly reasonable to believe that the One Piece is actually something that no one has even guessed at this point. And in particular, no one in the actual continuity of the manga. Is it something that is a sacred treasure, or is it something like Wunan in that it's something that was actually given away and doesn't have any material value within the world, but more of a symbolic value? Or is it a treasure that cannot be accessed or used within the world? That was certainly the case for Goldie Roger, as he noted when he got to Laugh-Tale that he was too early. So it makes you think. I also thought it was interesting to note that according to the fandom wiki, the One Piece movie was released as a double feature with Digimon Adventure Our War Game by Toei Animation. So perhaps at that time in the fandom, One Piece wasn't that big, and it's interesting to see that it was paired with another series that no one would expect would have some relationship to One Piece in the first place, particularly because One Piece is so much more popular than Digimon is at the present moment. Another thing that I'll note about the movie is that it had a very weird art style. It seemed clear that this wasn't a very big budget movie. The background trees and the landscapes looked awfully wooden in some places. The trees themselves in the forest that the characters were walking through as they made their way to find the treasure on the island looked remarkably like set pieces from a community theater, perhaps of a presentation of Into the Woods. Everything looked very two-dimensional. It looked like it was pasted on, and it was just wanting. It was a surprising difference from the type of artwork that you see in the actual show and in later movies coming down the line. In fact, the very next movie and its animation and background seemed to be worlds better in that respect. I'll also point out that the symbolism of the dragon is here as well. Dragons are a very present theme in One Piece. The name of the villain here, El Drago, basically means the dragon, and he had a somewhat dragon-like ability as he breathed energy blasts or destructive blasts from his mouth, kind of like a dragon breathes fire. Overall, the movie was enjoyable. It was a very simple story, but a very decent story. It's not the most entertaining feature, but as a fan of One Piece, particularly where we are in the series in 2025, it's a nice piece of content to return to see all of those symbols and the things that are meaningful and will be meaningful coming down the line. The Straw Hats in this movie weren't that powerful. They didn't have huge enemies to face, and the villain of this arc was rather meek by comparison to other villains that the Straw Hats have faced or will face in the series. The story was not that engrossing, but it was a smaller story and it had its own appeal, which I appreciated. It was definitely a B- type of movie, but still very enjoyable, especially as a fan of the series. Although, if I was a new fan to One Piece and I used this movie as an introduction to the series, I'm not certain that it would necessarily make me want to continue watching or research or look deeper into what the One Piece story is about. Although, as a nostalgic piece of content, as someone who's read hundreds of issues of One Piece manga and have watched hundreds of episodes of One Piece, it is far more enjoyable to me to look at the nostalgia of it and the symbolism of it. But it's definitely not a series that would make you want to come back to it as a new viewer, especially in comparison to other movies that are to come. So that is the Tales of Laughter review of the One Piece movie. I hope you enjoyed, and I suggest you watch the movie yourself, especially if you're a fan of One Piece. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.